All right, I think we're going to start. Welcome everybody to this first episode in our new Women's Power to Stop War webinar series. My name is Emma Bergesser. I'm the International Anniversary Coordinator for WILPF's upcoming 100th anniversary. I'm happy to see so many of you are here, which brings me to some technical issues. I know you can't see me right now. That's because I'm doing this from an internet cafe in India. But don't worry, I'll only talk for a few more minutes, and then the other panelists you will be able to see on webcam. Also, some other technical information for those of you that are less familiar with this webinar format. First, it's okay that we can't hear or see you because of the number of participants in this format. That's okay. You'll just be able to see the panelists. Also, at the very end, we will have time for questions. You'll be able to ask a question by clicking on the little hand symbol on your screen on the webinar desktop, but please hold all questions till the end because otherwise we won't get through the webinar. All right, so I just want to tell you why we are organizing this series. It's part of the movement Women's Power to Stop War, which celebrates over 100 years of women peacemaking. This started in 1915 in The Hague when over 1,300 women came together to protest World War I. This was the first time an international peace conference of that size was ever organized for and by women, and it is where the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom was founded. And since then, WILPF has been working on bringing a gender perspective to issues of peace and security. This webinar series is part of these celebrations, and so the series is hosted by our newly put together academic network, which we're very proud of. And so to tell you more about that now is Barbara Trzejanowska. She's the coordinator of the academic network. So I'm happy to give the word to her right now. And if you wait just a few seconds, you'll be able to see her on the webcam. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the webinar.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. Hello, everyone. My name is Barbara Trzejanowska, and as Emma said, I coordinated this recently established academic network.
There's one second. I'm trying to turn on your camera.
Oh, is it helpful what I did now? Or
yeah.
Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Barbara Trzejanowska, and as Emma said, I coordinate this recently established academic network of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. This is the very first event of this academic network, and I'm very excited, a little bit stressed. And my role today is to introduce our wonderful speaker, Cynthia Enloe. But before I do that, I would like to say just a few words about the academic network and the ideas lying behind. So the WILPF Academic Network is a sort of think tank that addresses issues of women, peace, and security by connecting a global network of academics and peace activists. And this academic network was established as a sort of recognition of the importance of building bridges between academia and civil society, and the importance of connecting researchers and practitioners, and of a sort of integrating academic expertise into political actions. And these ideas are obviously not new for the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And I would like to use this opportunity to thank to Petra Totterman-Andorf, who used to be WILPF International Coordinator, who is not working on this project anymore, but who laid the very foundations of this project. Yes, and the academic network is comprised of 23 very dedicated scholars. They represent different regions, both the global north and the global south. They are affiliated to various universities, And I would like to say just half of a sentence about each of them. So if I can have the first slide once again, yes, thank you. I will be extremely brief. So Radhika Balakrishnan and Savi Bisnath are both from the Center for Women's Global Leadership, where Radhika is the executive director. Hilary Chersworth is the director of the Center for International Governance and Justice at the Australian National University. Christine Chinkin is a professor of international law at the London School of Economics. Cynthia Cockburn is just another great name of feminist research. It's an honorary professor of gender and women's studies at the University of Warwick. Cynthia Enloe, I will get back soon. Vanessa Farr is an independent consultant who specializes on MENA region, and she was gender and conflict advisor at the UNDP. I think I skipped Katia Confortini, who is assistant professor of peace and justice studies at Wesley College. Dennis Horn is an assistant professor of international affairs at Northeastern University. Natalia Huston is a professor at the University of Dayton, Ohio. Lynette Jackson is an associate professor of gender and women's studies and African American studies at the University of Illinois. Susan Jackson is professor of international relations at Malmo High School and the leader of a project investigating militarization through gender lens. Jamie Lederman is director of international studies at Fairfield University. Diane Mazurana is the research director of gender, youth and community at Tufts University. Sandra McEvoy is a professor of political science at the Willock College. Marlene McFederan is the founding director of the Institute for International Women's Rights of the University of Winnipeg. Joy Onesho conducts now her research for her doctoral degree in transformative studies and is affiliated to the University of Nigeria. Nicola Pratt is a reader of international politics of the Middle East at the University of Warwick. Elizabeth Krug is a professor of international relations at the Institute of International Development Studies in Geneva and director of Gender and Global Change Program. Emma Rosengren conducts her doctoral research on gender and nuclear weapons at Stockholm University. Laura Shepard is professor at international relations at the University of New South Wales. Jackie True is a professor of international relations at the Monash University. And finally, Annick Wieben is an associate professor of international politics at the University of San Francisco. So I just would like to give you a sort of feeling who is in this academic network, and you will have a chance to hear other professors in the upcoming seminars. So now, finally, to Cynthia Enloe. So I believe that Cynthia doesn't need any introduction, and I'm sure we got many of you today due to her name. Cynthia is a professor of political science at the International Development Community Environment Department, Clark University, Massachusetts, and she has a really amazing career that included Fulbrights in Malaysia and Guyana, guest professorship in Japan, Canada, and Britain. And she was giving lectures in Norway, Sweden, Korea, Germany, around the United States, and in many other countries. Her main research interests focus on the interactions of feminism, militarized culture, politics, and global economics. And she has been part of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and she has supported our work for many years and agreed without any hesitations to be with us today. And I'm very pleased now to give the virtual floor to Cynthia.
Hi, everybody. Can you see me? Hi. It's a delight to be here, and especially I want to give thanks to the Global Village that created this webinar. First of all of you who signed up and at many hours of the night and the morning in the middle of your busy days have joined in. I think it's quite remarkable. The last number I heard was 101 of us are all together today, which is really quite amazing. It's almost as amazing as all those women who got to the Hague somehow in 1915. So we're kind of a global Hague this morning. I'd especially like to thank Barbara, who you just heard, and at the start, Emma, who's in India, and Maria, who is handling all the visuals here, and she's in Geneva. So to Emma and Barbara and Maria, a special thanks, because it's only because of you that we're all in touch with each other today. What we're going to do today is talk a bit about how militarism depends on women, and how women can become militarized, sometimes against their will, of course, but oftentimes because militarism includes some kinds of goals and rewards that some women find quite appealing. I don't think we should ever underestimate how appealing militarism is to lots of different kinds of people, people who would be quite appalled to think that they were complicit in killing, but in fact absorb and even promote militaristic ideas in their lives. And to stop war, I think, requires all of us to really think about how complicit we are in militarism, and to stop the militarism that seeps into our own relationships and our own outlook on the world. So I think Maria is going to handle our very minor slideshow, which, by the way, was put together by Barbara. So it really is taking a village here. So Maria, do you want to try and do the first slide and see where we are there? Ah, look at that. This is wonderful. This is a slide that is obviously of Americans. It looks to me as if it's largely white Americans. Those of you who are attending the seminar via your phones can't see the photograph, but don't worry, the photographs will be described along the way. This is a picture that probably was during one of the United States' recent wars. It's got ordinary civilians lining up on the curb of a town road, not a major highway. They're waving American flags. They're obviously waiting for soldiers to walk by or march by. There are people with signs that say, "Our hero, thank you for your service," and Rangers, that's a special force, lead the way. These are, if you will, ordinary civilians. They are not themselves necessarily in the military, although some of them probably are in military families. And the reason I think this is such a telling photo is not because they're Americans, although certainly many Americans are militarized, but because militarization really depends on ordinary citizens, I think, becoming proud of their soldiers, and especially proud of their soldiers, perhaps more proud of their soldiers than they are of, let's say, women who work in battered women's shelters, or women who do social service work, or women who are peace activists. There is something about militarism that really inculcates a particular pride, I think, in our own country's soldiers, as if people who join our country's militaries, and I mean all over the world, not just the Americans, people who join the military are somehow thought to be more heroic than people who work in a rape crisis center. And I think that's a very dangerous idea. I certainly understand how people can become proud of their sons or their daughters, mostly sons, but some daughters, who join their country's military. And some countries' militaries, of course, are fighting wildfires in Australia, or helping to rescue people from monsoons in Bangladesh, and are doing important work that isn't necessarily fighting wars. But what the idea of the hero is based on is war fighting. And so this picture we all, the four of us together, chose because we wanted to really start off by talking about how ordinary civilians become militarized by being lured, I think, into being especially proud of their country's soldiers. Let's look at the next slide now. And again, I'll describe it for those of you who aren't seeing the visuals. This is a photograph that, for those of you who can see it, you've probably become very familiar with in the last several years, particularly maybe the last 10 years. And it is, I think, a British soldier wearing a beret of one of the British regiments. And he's got on a wedding ring, and he is embracing what perhaps is his wife. It looks as though it's a going away ceremony before he goes off to be deployed. Now, the reason that this photo is useful, I think, is to think about all the family members of soldiers around the world. And family members can be quite extended. They can be uncles and aunts and cousins and nephews and nieces. And governments really depend, I think, on women in military families staying loyal not only to their brothers or their husbands or their nephews, occasionally their nieces or their sisters, but to really remain loyal to the cause that the soldier is sent off to fight. I've thought a lot about women in military families. I don't know enough, and maybe some of you are in military families. Just recently, a woman came up to me, and a young woman, and said she had just returned to university for her education, but she said it is so confusing to be in a military family. It is so difficult to sort out how to be good to, loyal to, in whatever familial way you want to be loyal to your own family member, and to separate that out from the cause for which the family member is sent off as a military member to fight. And because governments, all kinds of governments, the Congolese government and the Cambodian government and the Chinese government and the Canadian government and the Australian government and certainly the American government, because all governments really put a lot of pressure on members of families, and especially wives and mothers, I think, to express their loyalty to their loved one in the form of loyalty to the family, to the government's military cause. It becomes really hard to demilitarize yourself if you're a member of a military family. And so this photo, it could be of any soldier in any military who has any family members that include girlfriends or wives or sisters or mothers. And one of the ways in which governments really militarize women, I think, is by trying to glue together, as if they're inseparable, the loyalty that you feel to a family member and the loyalty to the government's military cause. Now, it doesn't mean that women in military families aren't thinking individuals. They are. But I think a lot of us who are active in peace movements feel very awkward around members of military families. We're afraid, I think, oftentimes that they are glued, if you will, not only to their family member who's in the military, but to the military's war-waging cause. And because we feel awkward, we, I think, sometimes slip into kind of unthinking or maybe just nervous assumptions about members of military families. And as a result, a lot of women who are married to or girlfriends of or are mothers of military personnel, I think oftentimes feel as though those of us who are in peace movements or those of us who are activists against any particular military operation, that we are condescending towards those women, that we are snubbing them, that we're arrogant, at minimum that we're not very curious. And so I think all of us who are trying to roll back militarism and trying to prevent wars and stop the current wars, I think all of us have to really be a lot more curious about and do a lot more outreach and learn about the lives of women in families whose family members are in militaries. I think it's a lot of work. I think it's not usually the top of our agendas, but I think it would make us a lot smarter in a really compassionate kind of wisdom if we spent a lot more time thinking about women who are in military families and thinking about them by listening to them. And it doesn't mean we'll always agree, by the way, but it will make us smarter. Let's take a look, Maria, at the next slide. There we go. This is a slide that, again, the four of us that put together the presentation this morning, that's Emma and Maria and Barbara and I. So don't forget, this is a group of four that has tried to present this seminar to you this morning. This is in a war zone. You can see that it looks like it's a man. A male soldier is in full battle garb, complete with, of course, a heavy-duty rifle there. The women look either anxious or very skeptical. I think the older woman looks particularly skeptical, and particularly skeptical at the photographer, which then makes you think about what it means to be taking photographs in a war zone. And the woman with the young child looks quite worried. Now, in all of our work, and I know a lot of you who are taking part this morning have a lot of firsthand knowledge yourselves, and perhaps you'll contribute that when we come to the discussion part. I know that this seminar, as many seminars are, is made up of people who themselves have a lot of experience and a lot of ideas. And a lot of you know that within a war zone, there can be very complicated relationships between women and men. Men as soldiers from various sides, and a lot of wars are not just two sides, they're three sides or four sides. And that women of different generations, and here we have three different generations, are going to experience living in a war zone differently. They're going to have to make relationships with each other as women. They're going to have to figure out how to tell each other what strategies are best for avoiding angering that soldier there with his weaponry. They're going to have to figure out how to bargain with soldiers of all sides. Oftentimes people live in towns and villages that switch sides. That is, they're occupied by one force, then they're occupied by another force. I think oftentimes about women living in various villages in Afghanistan and who have gone through a series of occupations, not just one occupation, but several occupations. Occupations by American forces, occupations by Afghan forces, occupations by British or Swedish forces, occupations by Taliban forces. And if the people are able to stay in their villages, and we'll talk about refugees in just a minute, women are going to have to figure out, and do figure out, how best to create their own sense of very minimal security. And minimal security oftentimes means making bargains, making compromises with the male soldiers that are occupying their space. So that any war zone is a very complicated social space. And I think one of the things that feminists have taught us, and you saw in the group of the new WILPF academic network, you saw the picture of Diane Mazarana, who's a longtime colleague of mine. And Diane has worked in Nepal and northern Uganda, as well as Afghanistan, and she reminds us constantly that a war zone is a complicated place. It is a place where gender relationships are under a lot of strain. On the one hand, in an occupied zone, oftentimes men in households are very determined that the women in their households really squeeze back in to the narrowest notion of feminine respectability for the sake of not trespassing on any cultural taboos in the midst of a military occupation. On the other hand, if you are a woman living in a war zone, oftentimes it's precisely because you're undergoing multiple occupations and so much uncertainty that, in fact, you have to break out of those norms, maybe even norms that you yourself have accepted, but norms about what it is that's respectable for a woman to do, because you do have to go further for the firewood. You do have to make bargains at checkpoints. You do have to figure out ways to carry on farming because your husband or your father has been taken prisoner, or because he's gone off to fight in another force. So that war zones are very complicated gender scenes, and women making these bargains and making these strategic decisions have to be really taken seriously when we come to what we hope will be some kind of ceasefire negotiation and maybe even a peace negotiation. One of the things that what is called Security Council Resolution 1325, which WILPF has had a major hand in both drafting and keeping many elites' feet to the fire to implement. One of the things that they have underscored in pushing for the passage and the implementation of 1325 is that women's experiences in war zones have built up a kind of knowledge, a kind of expertise that needs to be present at any ceasefire negotiation table or any peace negotiation table. That precisely, take a look at these women. These women have expertise that needs to be brought into peace negotiations. They are not just passive. They are thinking. You can look at them, and they are thinking. They are strategically weighing options. They have dealt with that soldier in the background. They deal with him every day and his colleagues. And out of that, they have gained a lot of experience that would be most useful if we're going to have anything like a sustainable ceasefire, or even better, a sustainable peace. Let's take a look at the next picture. Maria there, okay. See, this is a very human endeavor. So although we're all looking at each other on screens, we should think of Maria there in Geneva trying to make sure that the slideshow works, and think of Barbara, who found all these great photographs. Let me just alert you. I'm here at my home computer, and that's my study in the background, and a window out into the neighborhood. Every once in a while, you'll hear a train go by. I live right on the commuter railroad, which I love. I love trains. But every once in a while, you'll hear a roar, and that is the commuter train taking people to work in Boston. I'm in Boston. The other thing I should alert you to is that you may see one of my cats walk by, so don't be alarmed. It's just a household cat meandering through, paying no attention to this website, this webinar at all. This photograph is from Ethiopia. It is a Somali woman and her child. And the two of them, that is she as a caretaker of this child, she and with her child have escaped to across the border to Ethiopia from the war in Somalia. You can see on the, whoops, are we there? Wait, here we are. You can see through the tent that it's a tent from the UNHCR. That's the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. And women who've become refugees are women who have crossed an internationally recognized state border. If you have been displaced from your home, as so many Syrians have been now, and Iraqis before them, and Somalis within Somalia, if you're still within your own country's borders, the international community calls you an internally displaced person. and you have a different legal status. If you are, quote unquote, a refugee, that is in international terms, you are now taking refuge in somebody else's country across an international border. If you are an internally displaced person, you are not as likely to have UNHCR assistance. Humanitarian aid groups will try to service you, either the Red Crescent or the International Red Cross, Doctors Without Borders. Many groups will try to be of service to people who've been displaced from their own home but are still in their own country's borders. This Somalia woman is across the border. She's in Ethiopia, and she's now seeking help from the UNHCR. A lot of the work that has been done by feminists in war zones has been to try and make women's lives as refugees not only more survivable, that is, with food, with shelter, and with medical care, all of which is absolutely crucial, but also to be sure that any woman who becomes a refugee, and I oftentimes think about this, and maybe some of you who are taking part in the seminar today have yourselves at some point in your life, or your mother has been a refugee, and you don't become a non-person. You are still a thinking person. You're still a person who has been brought up with certain ideas about what it means to be a woman and how to act as a mother. You are still somebody who has aspirations and hopes for yourself as a woman. You're still somebody who has ideas about how you should be raising your children. And these don't just go away simply because you've been turned into what the international community calls a refugee. So a lot of feminists have been working either outside the UNHCR or as staff people inside the UNHCR. There are feminists inside these humanitarian aid organizations. And they have worked very hard, especially over, I think, the last 10 to 15 years, to try and make refugee organizations, that is aid organizations, a lot more savvy about trying to keep women empowered, even if in a minimal sense, to give them a sense of dignity, to give them space to make their own decisions. But it is very easy for any humanitarian aid organization to slip into imagining that women are simply victims. That is, victims to be fed, victims to be sheltered, victims to be cared for, all of which is compassionate and important, but deprives women of their full range of thinking capacities and acting capacities. So with our thinking about militarism, we need to think that to work against militarism is not simply to turn all women into unthinking refugees, unthinking displaced people, unthinking victims. They are people who still have their own ideas, they still have their own aspirations, and they have many skills. So in trying to make peace, trying to make a sustainable peace, one really needs to think hard about how to make sure that women who've been turned into displaced persons or refugees can take part in that process. Women coming home from refugee camps, or a lot of women who are refugees aren't in camps. They try to find housing in vacant buildings oftentimes. If they're lucky, they have a bit of money for rent, but in towns and in cities. Not all women who are refugees are in UNHCR run camps. Oftentimes they are much more dispersed and therefore more invisible. But they too need to take part in any kind of effort to understand how militarism works, how militarism helps sustain hatred, how militarism creates a sense of desire for vengeance or a desire to return to a kind of militarized normalcy, which is sometimes what pre-war looks like. So that I think when we look at this Somalia woman, we need to really think, what role is she going to be able to play when she returns to Somalia? Or if she decides it's too dangerous to return to Somalia, how will she be integrated into Ethiopian society? And how can she be part of thinking about those options? A friend of mine, colleague, Anita Fabos, who's an anthropologist who works in Sudan, has warned me and warned all of us not to imagine that every person who's displaced physically by war always wants to, quote, go home. And we mustn't just set up refugee systems that push people back into places that they find still insecure. That's a complicated international process, but this woman needs to be part of that process, not just a chess piece to be pushed around for the sake of what ungender conscious negotiators think a post-war should look like. Let's look at the next photo, Maria. Ah, this is all too familiar. Okay, those of you who can see the screen will see what all of us have seen in newspapers and in international relations textbooks, with no skeptical caption underneath. I read captions. I bet all of you read captions, because I'm always interested in what a caption pinpoints and what a caption leaves out. This is a picture of men. They mostly look like European ancestried men. Most of them look as though they're losing a bit of their hair and probably are at least middle-aged. And they are signing an agreement with many pens. They're all in dark suits and white shirts, and they seem to be at a very formal peace signing ceremony. And most of the textbooks or most of the newspapers captions, which are written by people, of course, I always wonder who writes captions, would probably make this a quite unremarkable photograph and would concentrate on what document they're going to sign with their dozen pens in front of them. They might give you a clue as to who some of the main signatories are, and they'd probably do that by whether they were the foreign ministry of this or the prime minister of that, or the secretary general of some international organization. But my guess is, unless it's a textbook by one of the academic network whose members you saw early on, or maybe by a textbook or a newsletter written by one of you with your feminist consciousness, if you wrote the caption, my guess is you'd say, who are the two women way in the back of the room? How did they get into the room? Why is it that they have been brought into this very, not only militarized space, none of these people are in uniform, but rather into this very masculinized space? But when I say masculinized, what I mean is not just that they are all but two men, and there, for those of you who can't see the picture, there must be 1, 2, 3, 4, there must be maybe 20 people whose faces you can see in this photograph. By masculinized, it just doesn't mean that they are mostly men in the room, but rather that the space has been defined as one in which men who count as serious, always put question marks or put quotation marks around serious, those men who've been counted as serious have gotten to take serious action by signing a serious document. And they are serious because they are manly, and they are manly in a very particular fashion. They don't seem to be members of any military, although oftentimes for these sorts of events, men who are professional military men will dress in civilian diplomatic attire for men. But what WILPF and many peace activists, including yourselves, protest is this idea that these sorts of spaces are particularly customary for manly rational, all in quotes, men. That these sorts of processes should be ones in which diverse women take part, women who are not just speaking for themselves, but women who are connected to women's groups in their countries. It's not enough to add a Margaret Thatcher to this picture. It's not enough to add even an Ellen Johnson Sirleaf to this picture. That is the current president of Liberia. The women who have to infuse these spaces, to demasculinize them in the sense of making them less exclusive, making them open to women's experiences and women's ideas and women's values and women's goals, need to be the sorts of women who are directly connected to women's grassroots organizations and who have learned gender analysis, who have feminist ideas about what it takes to create a sustainable peace. So to change this caption, well, first of all, we should write a caption that makes it clear that this is a very exclusionary group of people, that it is a very masculinized group of people, and if they are signing a peace accord, the very fact that they are doing it in such a masculinized process probably means that the peace is not going to be sustainable, because it's not based on enough knowledge about what went on in war zones. Those women sitting on the bench, the older woman and the younger woman holding the child with the soldier in the background, somebody who knows their experiences should be here in the room. The Somali woman in the Ethiopian UNHCR camp, somebody, either she or somebody who represents her and knows her experiences as a refugee, should be here in the room. That the document that these very quote unquote serious men are signing with all their pens is not going to be worth very much if those experiences of women who've experienced war and displacement aren't part and parcel of this, not just to sign the document, but to draft it, to make sure that it includes the kinds of promises and pledges and resources that can really roll back militarism effectively. So think about photos like this. I have an informal file of photos of masculinized spaces, and someday maybe I'll go about making alternative captions. But you might think about a project of alternative captions for photos such as this that go so unquestioned. Maria, what's next? This is The Hague, I believe. And this, look at all these women. Some of them know that their photo is being taken. You can see they've turned around and they're looking up towards either their friends and colleagues in the balcony, or maybe they realize that somebody with a very elaborate, cumbersome camera is in the balcony taking photographs of them, and they want to make sure that not just the backs of their heads are showing for this historic occasion. This is the meeting of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, held in The Hague. What's remarkable about this group of women is what it took to get there. This is a wartime conference. This is 1915, being held in The Hague in the Netherlands, in the middle of a devastating First World War, which of course at the time was called the Great War, because nobody realized that it was going to be the first of at least two. It's only we today who refer to it as the First World War. These women hoped it would be the last World War. I look at this photograph and I think several things, well, a whole bunch of things. And of course, like you, I'm sure you have a lot of questions. First of all, I want to look at every single case. Pause for a minute now. I'm going to give us all a chance just to be quiet for a second. Look at as many of the faces as you can. Just take a look. How did each of those women get there? Literally, how did they get there? Did they come by train? Were the trains running? How dangerous was it? Did they come by steamship? If they came from Canada, they certainly did. How did they get there? What kind of money did they have to raise? The other thing I think of is, how did they get there intellectually, if you will? That is, each of these women had to make not just a great investment in, they had to travel an intellectual journey, just as all of us have. We're only in this webinar because we're already on a journey to try and make better sense of this world. What kind of journey did each of these women take? Katia Confrontini, who is one of the members of the network, has studied the early days of WILPF. And Katia talks with great passion about how these women, each of them, had to take their own journey to decide that militarism was at the heart of war, and that to confront militarism would require their own thinking and their own efforts. To take on militarism is a long, long process. Each of them had to figure out where women were in the process, the extent to which women had to say no to the very alluring package of militarism in order for wars to stop. That they not only had to say no in their own lives, they had to join an organization, an international, brand new international organization, to roll back militarism. Because militarism, as I said, is very appealing. Let me just run through some of the parts of the package that makes up militarism. Militarism is a way of looking at the world, and it's a way of looking at the world that imagines that the world is a very dangerous place. Now, all of these women, my guess is, by the very fact that they took this journey, both intellectual and physical, realized that the world, particularly in 1915, but if you are living in many parts of the world today, you would know, the world is a dangerous place. That's one of the key parts of the package of militarism. You can believe that and not take on the rest of the package and not be very militarized. And in fact, to deny that the world is a dangerous place, if you are that Somali woman, would sound foolhardy. But believing that the world is a dangerous place is one of the key elements of a militarized view of the world. What you do with your sense of danger is then what's really important. The next set of ideas that encourage a militarized view of the world is that the world is made up of us and them, and that they, the them, are enemies. Now, the women in this room, and again, I'm looking at each one of them, and I don't imagine that they all agree with each other, and they have probably very different personalities, that you can imagine that the world is a dangerous place and not immediately leap to the belief that people naturally have enemies. And naturally, of course, means unthinkingly have enemies, inevitably have enemies. So you can think one part, you can adopt one part of the militarized view of the world, but not adopt the second part. A third part is that there are protectors in the world and there are the protected. And these women definitely have rejected this idea, because in many ways they are supposed to be at home. Many of them look as though they're at least quite middle class women who probably have been taught. You can see the ones who are wearing hats. It was very respectable to wear a hat. What is striking is how many women are not wearing hats, which means they're already challenging feminine respectability in 1915. But that the idea that a respectable woman is a woman who not only is protected and accepts protection from the men in her lives, her husband, her father, men in general, all those men with the pens in the photograph at the peace signing conference we just looked at, but that the men in their lives are only manly men if they are the protectors of women. And that is one of the key patriarchal ideas in a militarized package, I think, that the world is made up of the protected and the protectors. And men who have to be protected are unmanly men. Women who defy men's protection in order to create their own systems of politics, as these women were doing, are not respectable women because they won't be accepting of men's protection, but also because they refuse to be grateful for men's protection. And here in The Hague, they are even saying that men aren't protectors, they are war wagers, and that certainly doesn't provide protection. Another part of the package is that men who join militaries are amongst the first-class citizens of their countries. They are the ones who, quote, are willing to lay down their lives for the sake of defending their countries. And that, of course, is an idea that makes a lot of mothers proud, a lot of wives proud, a lot of girlfriends and sisters and daughters proud. But it is a crucial part of the masculinized segment of militarism. So these women here are defying at least 4 elements of the package. While they may think that the world is a dangerous place, they refuse to see feminine respectability take the form of being grateful for masculinized protection. And they certainly are not sure that men joining militaries are the men that they most want to raise and nurture, admire, and be loyal to. So I love looking at this picture because it really is a picture of defiance, and it's not only a picture of defiance of militarism, it's a picture of defiance of a patriarchal structure that holds up militarism, or maybe it's better to say that patriarchy is the fuel of the air polluting fuel of militarism. Let's take a look at this last picture now. Maria, are you there? There we go. Now this is today. Well, it's probably not exactly today. It's probably just a couple of years ago. And many of you can immediately guess where this is. Say it to yourself. Yes, you're right. This is Liberia, I believe. And what is striking here is that it's not only women and men together joyful at the ending of a war in Liberia, a devastating war in Liberia, but what you also see here is women organized to end the war. That is, there are women cheering other women, and the women with their NPA t-shirts are women who organized in the middle of war. Just as the women who came to The Hague in 1915 were organizing against militarism and against war in the middle of war, so these women in Liberia organized effectively against militarism, that is, against the ideas, against the presumptions, against the relationships that cause war, but also against war waging itself. And they are being cheered. The women who met in The Hague in 1915 were oftentimes scorned. The women here in Liberia are being cheered by other Liberians, both women and men. And this brings us back to the current effort by WILPF and by other peace organizations in so many countries and transnationally. And that is the effort to institute the implementation of 1325, that's the UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which is not just a bureaucratic document. It is a pledge, and it's a pledge based on feminist understandings of how you create sustainable peace. And that sustainable peace is not going to be possible, is not going to be workable, unless women's ideas, and that means women's ideas about gender, women's ideas about gender equity, women's ideas about how gender distortions feed militarism. Those ideas actually have to be at the peace table. Those ideas have to be part and parcel of peace building. I was just in Ohio yesterday with Carol Cohn, who many of you know, and is a colleague of Sandy McAvoy, whose picture you just saw. And Carol, who works very closely with a lot of the UN feminist lobbyists to implement 1325, warned us all that if we're going to think about peace building, we have to think about roads. We have to think about infrastructure. We have to think about water system. We have to think about lighting. We have to think about electricity. That peace building means that women's ideas about what are the best roads to build for the sake of rebuilding society. Where should water sources be so that women's security is genuine security when they have access to those water supplies? What kind of lighting do you need so that peacetime doesn't bring sexual violence in the dark against women? And so Carol's point was that peace building is a process that requires gender analysis, and it requires women's experiences of how gender ideas can make them insecure even after the peace is signed. I think the work that all of you are doing, and I wish I could meet every one of you, but maybe in the discussion time I'll hear some of your ideas. But I think the work that all of you are doing is to make us smarter about what kinds of ideas about women and about men, about masculinity and about femininity, fuel the beginnings of war. Because most wars cannot be launched unless the militarized fertilizer has been laid down in the years before. Militarization is what it takes to create war. Wars don't happen unless there is a militarized set of ideas and social relationships and politics before the war. Wars themselves are gendered, and the relationships that happen during wars oftentimes confine women all the more, or open up opportunities, not opportunities in the sense that makes war good, but are forced on women and men so that women acquire skills that they need to use in the post-war. And post-war is still referencing war. It's post-war. And in post-war, we also need women's skills. Cynthia Coburn, another of the wonderful network whose pictures you saw at the beginning, has talked a lot about the post-war moment and how important it is that feminist ideas about patriarchy, feminist ideas about sexism, feminist ideas about how sexism and patriarchy sustain militarism are made crucial to building a genuinely sustainable peace, not a peace based on manly men using a dozen pens to sign a document that is completely without gender knowledge. Thanks, everybody. Let's open it to discussion.
Oh, thank you very much, Cynthia. So I think that was very challenging, and I'm sure a lot of us have questions and comments to make or remarks. All of those will be welcome. So what I will do is I'll be reminding you now what Emma told you, which is that there should be a little hand that you should be able to, it should be on the left of your menu, and you should be able to press it, and then I could see that you are requesting the floor. So now it could be a good moment to do so. I can already see during the seminar, I could already see some hands up. So I will be giving each one of you the floor. I will say in your name so that you can see that you can then talk, and then I I will be opening your microphone. Also, you might have questions for Cynthia. Also, if there are more questions about WILPF, feel free to address Emma or Barbara, and I'm sure they'll try to answer. So now I am going to unmute Suzanne. Suzanne, Suzanne Urban, did you want to ask a question?
No.
Sorry.
No, sorry.
It was on
Hi,
since a very long
Suzanne.
time ago. Sorry about that, Suzanne. It was on since a really long time ago, so I didn't know if you wanted to ask a question. So, Milena, would you like to ask a question?
Yes. Hi. So I just wanted to ask you about basically one of the photos that we saw about the men, the serious manly men in suits and signing important peace documents, and you remarked that there should be women there who have had direct experience in conflict zones, or at least women who can speak on behalf of those women. And I always wonder, is that the best way to go about? Because the thing is that why are we women trying to gain access to masculine spaces? And it's almost like I always imagine this kind of like parent-child dynamic, where the men are like the people that we ask permission for, and and they give it to us or they don't. So whether or not they are in that room does not always mean that they will be heard, or that they will not experience a kind of secondary or kind of another form of violence just by being in that room. I don't know if that makes any sense. So I'm wondering if that's the best way, or how can some of those issues be countered if women do end up in those spaces. Yes.
Milena, hi. That's a fabulous question. I think a lot of people, all of us, I think about it all the time. I mean, don't you? Every time you see, usually women remain a minority. So let's say all of a sudden at that signing session, we saw 2 women and all the rest men. And I think immediately we would all ask, well, who are they? Not who are they simply by their name, but to what extent have they been tokenized? To what extent are they in the room just to make the process look less exclusivist, right? So I think that peace accords are themselves a process, and they're very gendered. And you're quite right that we need to be skeptical about any women simply being shoehorned, if you pardon the expression, in, if they don't have ties to genuine activist groups in their society, that is, women's groups in their society. All too often, women are, put in a process, and as you suggested, they oftentimes are pretty silenced in the process. They don't get to really shape the process. I think what 1325 promoters, people who are really trying to make it a genuine reform of the way wars end, because that's really what 1325 is about. How do wars end? Who makes promises to whom? Who leaves what off the table that is never talked about? Who gets impunity? Who is given the benefits of keeping their weapons? All those sorts of agreements are woven into peace agreements. And if women are only there as tokens, in fact, it can be really dreadful, because it makes the peace agreement look on the surface more legitimate, at the same time as it has done nothing to undermine the kind of masculinized politics that created the war in the first place. So you're quite right, I think, and all of us really need to think about this, is how do we all, and that means those of us who aren't in the room, how do we all make sure that the women who do get in are in a process that is made more transparent, that is not just behind closed doors, that the women who do get to the table are women who check back with grassroots organizations, who are really able to push openly for a serious kind of transformation of what ending a war is all about. The reason it's not simply women joining the club is because these, if it works right now, these are women who are not just simply there to advance their own personal ambitions, which of course can happen. These are women who are there because they have ties to groups that have developed ideas, proposals, analyses that what is necessary to make a peace accord between men actually improve the security of women themselves. So great question, and I think the way to do it is to take that question and say, okay, here are the conditions then that we all, or in any war zone, or any of us who are trying to be of assistance to any women organized in war zones, here is the conditions by which we would want women selected for playing a part in a peace accord, and here is the process that we want the peace accord to have, including transparency, to make sure that women who are at the table are not just silenced or tokenized. Great, great question, Milena.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. Before I give the floor to the next person asking a question, I'm gonna ask Sharna DeLacy. I had your hand before, and now I don't see it anymore. So if you still want to ask a question, please raise your hand again. Now I'm giving the floor to Carlin, please. Hello. Carlin Hambuba.
Hello. Firstly, I want to thank Cynthia for the thought-provoking issue that she's raised. She's talked about many issues that we take for granted, like, for instance, the impact of war, of militarism on families. I think for me that is a key aspect that we mostly do not tend to tackle when we're talking about issues to do with militarism. Yeah, but I also want to add just the African perspective to this discussion. When we look at issues to do with peace and security in Africa, first I must admit that most of the issues that are being faced, like if you look at the presentation that Cynthia made, she's talked about issues of women not being at the forefront of the discussions to end, to bring about peace, and then just to end the wars that are happening. I think that is also an issue that is prevalent in Africa. We do not see many women on the negotiation tables discussing how to end peace. And yet, when you look at the way society is anchored in society, issues to do with peace are issues that mostly, when you look at the way a woman in Africa is socialized, they are peaceful people. And if more women are brought to the table to discuss peace, I think there would be more peace in the world. And then also another thing that we are facing in Africa is that there are a lot of international instruments that have been put forth to try and end these civil wars in the world. An instance is, for instance, the resolution 1325. I think there are many countries that are not implementing this resolution. And then also many African countries, they are party to all these international instruments, like for instance, CEDU, but it's the implementation is very, very low. And then in addition, also, if you look at the African Union Protocol on Women's Rights, it is also a document that articulates issues to do with peace, but implementation is very, very low. So I think for me, a key aspect in dealing with issues of peace and security, there is need, firstly, for a lot of advocacy and lobbying in terms of creating awareness about the need to bring women on board in discussions. And then not only that, there is need to promote democracy, because for as long as there's no democracy, we're always going to be having the conflicts that are bring about militarization in most of our countries, and especially in Africa. Thank you.
Oh, Colleen, thank you very, very much. And by the way, it's great for everybody to if they can, locate themselves so that we have an idea of what special expertise you're bringing to your discussion, which is great. You're absolutely right, I think, that no document, as forward-thinking as it is, as enlightened as it is in at least the letters on the page, is automatically implemented. It was hard enough to get the members of the UN Security Council, all of which represent governments, it was hard enough to get them even to sign on to 1325, and that took a lot of lobbying, a lot of strategic feminist lobbying. But once they signed it on behalf of the United Nations, but also on behalf of their own governments, that doesn't mean it's going to be implemented. And in fact, it's now been 13 years since 1325 was implemented, and every year in local groups lobbying their own countries, lobbying the UN peacekeeping missions that are in their own countries, and then a transnational group of feminists located in New York and another in Geneva, all of whom have to, as you say, you have to advocate, you have to lobby, and that takes a lot of stamina, and a lot of women are really busy. They don't necessarily have that kind of time in their busy days to do that kind of lobbying, that kind of monitoring. So those women who are doing that work really deserve our support. We should learn more about the kind of work they do, and we should be, and WILPF can help us learn about that, and we should really make it clear that we are watching, that it wasn't good enough just to sign that nice sounding document, whether it's the African Union document on women's rights or the UN Security Council 1325, that we're not going to give them credit just for signing. They actually have to implement it, and implementing 1325 and the African Union document on women's rights means that men have to change the way they behave towards each other, towards women in their own countries, towards women in other countries. They actually have to change their behavior, and that means they have to give up some privileges. And I think that ties right into your argument, a good argument, about the necessity of genuine democracy. Because genuine democracy, which none of our countries really have, genuine democracy means transparency, means openness, means that you have access to decision making. You know what is in the very, very, very fine print before it dominates your life. And democracy, true democratization, would mean lessening lots of men's privileges and monitoring a lot more men's non-compliance with the things that they've signed. I think shaming helps. I think monitoring helps. I think lobbying helps. So some shaming, some lobbying, some monitoring, and where possible, vote them out of office. But that means you've got to have free enough elections, and you've got to have political parties that aren't themselves patriarchal.
Thank you very much. I will now give the floor to Sharna. Just 1 second, please, Sharna. I will be unmuting you. You're unmuted, Sharna. Hello.
Thank you. Thank you,
Hi,
Cynthia. We're actually joining you in India with members from WILPF Costa Rica and WILPF Australia. We really enjoyed listening to you. I had a question. I'm writing a paper and doing some research in India on militarisation from a gender perspective, specifically with regards to India, which is right now the largest importer of arms. It's fast growing to become one of the world's largest militarized areas, with the largest standing army come 2020, if they continue at current pace. But they're also gearing up to build a very large domestic exportable defense industry here. And as everybody probably knows, because this is what tends to make the news, is the situation here for women in India is very, very dire, and they have huge amounts of poverty and all of these development issues. And I guess I would just like to take this opportunity to maybe pin some of your knowledge and see if you had any comments or opinions or any advice that you would share with regards to militarisation, its gendered implications in India.
Yes, I mean, you're much more the specialist than I am, so I guess one of the things that I would enter in here, something you undoubtedly know, but maybe other members of the seminar who haven't followed Indian politics quite so closely might not be aware of, and that is that India is building up its military, not just its military industrial complex. Because we talk about military industrial complex, and Susan Jackson, who's also a part of the network, has a lot of knowledge about this. But a military industrial complex we usually think of as referring to Britain or to France or to the United States. But now increasingly Brazil, India, other countries are really trying to compete in the international trade of armaments because it's such a lucrative trade. And I think for India, the Indian government now, and this could be whichever party's in power, the Indian government now has linked the expansion of its military and the expansion of its military industries to nationalism. That is that India's national pride is becoming more and more invested in being able to project not only its military strength, but its military industrial strength. And where a gender analysis, and particularly a feminist informed gender analysis, and when I say that, I think I should explain. A gender analysis means that you really are going to monitor the politics of masculinity and the politics of femininity. You're going to watch where women are and where men are and what it does to the relationships of each of them and the relationships of each of them to governments. A feminist gender analysis says you're always going to ask about power. So you do a gender analysis, but you always ask about power if you're doing a feminist analysis. And feminists have known that nationalist movements, not just against colonialism, but once the post-colonial era has started, nationalism becomes a state ideology as well. And nationalism can be infused with masculine privilege. A lot of women have fought, physically fought, but have worked hard to promote national integrity and national sovereignty and national autonomy against both colonial and neo-colonial and globalized capital sorts of compromising of national autonomy. But that doesn't mean that nationalism can't be infused with masculinist ideas. And there are a lot of women in the world, and Sharon, I'm sure you know this, there are lots of women in the world who have become quite disenchanted with nationalism when nationalism is used to promote militarism. And insofar as any government begins to talk about its own military aspirations in terms of fortifying the nation or projecting the nation's influence and the nation's defense, or as far as any government talks about expanding their own capacity to industrialize weaponry and sell weaponry on the international market for the sake of national pride, then in fact you're seeing not only the militarization of nationalism, but you're also seeing the masculinization of nationalism. So I think in India, but I think it would be true in many other countries as well, when one watches governments really try to expand their militaries and expand their military industries, beware of how they will try to tie it to the wings of nationalism and kind of resuscitate feminist critiques and warnings about nationalism being used to further marginalize women.
Thank you, Cynthia. And I think more is coming up as we are preparing with WILPF section a shadow report for CEDAW focusing on these topics in India. So Sharna will be helping us out. So we will be having very good information.
And you're going to share it with all. You're going to share it with all of us, right?
Of course,
Okay.
indeed. And we will be focusing on this, on militarization and armament in India. So it's
great. But let me just add a warning here.
Yeah.
It may be that a lot of women are going to get hired in a lot of the armament factories.
Yeah.
And they will be hired in the wiring departments.
Mm-hmm.
So we shouldn't imagine that a lot of women won't be getting economic opportunities out of the expansion of military industries, and a lot of women will be married to men or have men as fathers who will be gaining better paychecks, wages, because they're working in military industries. So the way that we ask questions about how women as wives and mothers and daughters get kind of pulled into militarism because their husbands have jobs they like, it can happen in civilian industries. I mean, civilian meaning they're not in uniform, in military industries as well. So early on, any critique of the armaments industry really needs to reach out and listen to and talk to women in the families of the men who work in those industries, and also women who themselves work in that industries. And my guess is the Swedish WILPF could help you out there, because I know the Swedish members of WILPF have been very concerned about the expansion of Swedish armaments industries and trying to think about women's very complicated relationships to arms industries. Arms industries can, become the support of families and the support of whole towns. So a lot of women become quite mixed. They aren't necessarily automatically against an arms industry expanding in their own hometown.
Yeah, see, I think those are great and very challenging comments, because what we are used to do, and I will not be very long, I will just stop there, but what we used to do in WILPF is comparing how much money we spend on armament and how much money we spend on health or education for women. So indeed, there's a lot of things to think about in terms of economic and social rights. We have another 4 speakers, so I will be running now to Rebecca Lloyd. Hello, Rebecca.
Hi, hello. Yeah, this is Rebecca Lloyd. I'm actually a captain in the U.S. Army, and I'm currently stationed in Afghanistan.
Hi.
I'm in the first semester of my master's in diplomacy at Norwich University, and focusing on gender issues here in Afghanistan. I'm actually a gender analyst for headquarters ISAF here in Kabul. And I've kind of been in a unique position since I've been here, where I've got to meet with fellow female military officers in the Afghan military, as well as female parliamentarians who are trying their hardest to get the EVAL law, which is the Elimination of Violence Against Women law here in Afghanistan, passed. And like you've mentioned, have been extremely marginalized with their roles within the parliament here in Afghanistan. And one of the things that I have noticed from being here the last 7 months is there's a lot of prominent women within the Afghan government, as well as within our U.S. or coalition military that's here, that are not kind of taking that front role for gender integration. Mainly Miss Adamati, who is a Deputy Chief of Staff for President Karzai, the most senior ranking female in Afghanistan, has made it abundantly clear to diplomats and other people that work over here that gender issues is important to her, but she's not pushing it as far as integration. And one of the key things that has recently changed within ISAF is now that we're getting ready to retrograde out Afghanistan and turn our mission to the resolute support and supporting Afghanistan in the security and stability of post-2014, is we are just now looking at the gender integration into the Afghan National Security Forces and the violence and abuse against the females in the Afghan forces. And so my question to you is, what do you see as far as the role of a woman that's within the military or within the government here, especially within Afghanistan, to help kind of the demilitarizing and violence against women with here and in Afghanistan. Because one of the things, like I said, I've met with junior officers that are also at the captain, lieutenant levels within the Afghan army who are extremely marginalized, passed over for promotion. There's numerous reports of, having to give sex in order to become a member of the Afghan National Police. I mean, it's just, I could go on for hours on the stuff that I witness and that I read about over here. And I'm struggling being a junior officer in a higher headquarters where we do have a female general, but again, she's the only female general within all of the general officers here at the headquarters. And again, when asked by the COM to head gender issues and gender integration on behalf of ISAF, she has turned it down. And thankfully, we have a male Canadian general who has kind of taken lead as we've now kind of developed this new task force, per se, on the ISAF side to kind of help JEROA and ANSF work on their gender issues and their violence against women issues. But here it is 2013, and we've been in this country for over 12 years, and it's just now becoming a main topic, a main focus of the coalition community that's here.
Wow, Rebecca, thank you. This is probably very interesting to everybody who's listening, and thank you for the work you're doing. I think it's true in not just Afghanistan, and as hard as it is there, but it is true that in many security sector reform efforts, and that's the term for those of you who don't hang out around UN people, security sector reform is the efforts to try and change not only police forces, but military forces and all the forces that are considered security forces. And that's a term now that is an umbrella term, but it includes both police and various branches of the military. Security sector reform is considered now part and parcel of building a more sustainable post-war, and of course the war isn't over in Afghanistan, but looking into the future, a post-war society and the kind of institutional structures for a post-war sustainable peace. And in every security sector reform effort that I've heard about, and I've been lucky enough to be brought in and talking with numbers of women who have been the first in their country to be a police chief, or the first in their country to be a senior member of the intelligence services, which are also important in the security sector, or are the first to climb to the level even of colonel in their country's military. What you hear over and over again, Rebecca, is how a woman who is a first, or is usually the first and only, and that means she's isolated, and in a very hierarchical structure like you have in police forces and militaries and intelligence services, if you have a hierarchical organization and you have only a few women who are promoted, they are by definition isolated, and they are surrounded by men, most of whom, not all of whom, but most of whom see gender equity as something that will demote them. And they put enormous pressure on women to blend in and to identify with everything but gender equity. And so I think we oftentimes burden women who are the first and the isolated in police and intelligence and militaries. We burden them with not only being the first in their rank, but also to take on the most unpopular, not the most perhaps, but one of the most unpopular issues, gender equity. So I totally understand. I'm not very happy about it, but I totally understand how a woman who feels isolated, is trying to make a career for herself, doesn't want to take on somebody else's unpopular issue, because she oftentimes mistakenly, I think, imagines that she got there under her own steam, and if she can do it, the other women should be able to do it. Don't burden her with pulling all the other women up with her. Now, what we know from feminists who try to make it in the world of banking or the world of the military or the world of the police or the world of the foreign service, that you never do things on your own. No woman ever does anything on their own, nor do any men, by the way. They are part of systems that have helped promote them. And so for you, Rebecca, I guess a couple of things is try in the little influence you have, but with your collective work with other junior officers who really care about gender equity, try to get several women in positions of some influence together, not kind of one woman at a time. And if necessary, get a woman and a man to take on gender equity so it's not thought by other colleagues of the more senior woman, that is at her rank, that because she's a woman, she's the only one who has to be responsible for gender equity. Gender equity is also a man's issue. It is about making a fairer society, a more just society. And if you can, I mean, this is me comfortably here in Boston talking to you in Kabul. If you can, though, try and to get it in small teams rather than one person being the gender point person. I know that's the UN model as well. It also isolates the gender advisor in UN peacekeeping operations. They have stories to tell. The other thing is, if the Afghan women, I know some of them already are, but if the Afghan women in the security sector can build up networks through groups like Swanee Hunt's group of women in security sector reform networks, so that they can really trade strategies and don't feel as though they are isolated there in Afghanistan. Women in Liberia, Sierra Leone, Cambodia, Iraq have really begun to build up networks. Women in Colombia and El Salvador as well. And I think for any woman who is the first, she can be pretty lonely, feel very vulnerable. And as you say, if they are in the lower ranks, they're vulnerable physically as well. But the more international networks these women can be part of, so that when you leave, they still have a network. They have a network who knows them by name, who strategizes with them. I think that would be an enormous help. And if I can be of any use in putting you in contact with Ambassador Hunt, who has created a network of women in security sector reform, I'd be happy to do that.
Great. Thank you, Cynthia. And I think those were very interesting comments. We still have 4 speakers left, and I think they are all very important. That's what I feel. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give... is it okay with you, Cynthia, if we take the 4 questions and then you take your notes and comment on the 4 at the same time?
Absolutely, and I'll make my comments shorter.
Great. Yes, and please do make your comments or questions short. I am going to give the floor to Maria Olivarria now. So just a second. Maria, tienes la palabra.
Hi, Maria.
Hi, I am from Caracas, Venezuela, and I am a conflict resolution and disarmament expert. I wanted to thank you for your excellent presentation. I found it truly inspirational. And I have 2 very short questions. Could you highlight a case where you believe women, through feminist ideas, have been successfully integrated into a peace-building process? And secondly, what would you think is the best tool women have today in being involved in peacemaking and peace-building processes?
Great, thanks.
Thank you very much, Maria.
Thank you.
Now there's the turn for Kelly. There's Kelly Jones. She doesn't have a working microphone, but I have here her question for you, Cynthia. My husband and I run a gender justice organization focused mainly on Burundi, Africa, and we work with men and women together to end gender-based violence and improve gender equality. What do you see as the role of men in transforming the role of women in increasing peace and security? And what efforts in regard to this webinar and the series are being made to increase participation by men? Second, why do you believe naming and shaming is an effective effective tool? Sorry. So that is from Kelly. Now I have Nuha here. Nuha, you have the floor.
Yes. Hi, Cynthia.
Hi there.
My question is very similar to Kelly's question. And I believe that sometimes women have restrictions, social restrictions. They can't go to, I'm from Lebanon, and we're working on the Syrian refugees and the Syrian war. And it's very hard for women to go and leave. You know, women have families, they have social restrictions, they can't go.
Yeah.
And in contrast, men have 100%, you know, they can go, but women like 20% probably, or 10% of them can participate. So I'm thinking if we can encourage men to be advocates for us, you know, sometimes I see on the table, at the table, like two women doing nothing and men are advocating for women's issues. So sometimes men can help.
Mm-hmm.
You see?
Yes.
I don't know if you got my question.
Yes, I did. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Nuha. Now I am going to give the floor to Rebecca. Rebecca, you have the floor. Tawada.
Hi. Thank you very much. Actually, the two last questions kind of overlapped on mine. I'd like to know what are your views on issues such as sexual violence being portrayed in official discourse as mostly exclusively women's issue? And further on, this the importance of discourse portraying these issues just as women's as opposed to gendered issues.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, all of you. So, Cynthia, you have now the floor for these last questions and also for your closing remarks.
Well, I think I'll try and tackle these wonderful thoughts. By the way, thank you to everybody's willingness to take part in the discussion. This is just great. I've scribbled notes to myself and learned a lot from all of your comments. Maria, I think we don't have any 100% success stories. I wish we did. What we do have is bits of success that have occurred in various countries, at least for some of the time. And I think there's that office in the United Nations called the Lessons Learned Office. And I think in some ways we have to look at what has succeeded in some countries some of the time and keep putting those together for fuller success. So for instance, all of you, I'm sure, are aware of the South African post-apartheid constitution writing. And one of the success stories there is the South African women, especially women then in the ANC, making sure that they got to be part of the constitution writing process. And one of the reasons that the Constitution is as progressive, at least on paper, as it is, I think, is because of South African women activists, anti-apartheid, gender-smart activists, making sure that they were there not just at the peace table, but at the Constitution writing table. And that's very important. I think that women in Liberia have or women into security forces. And we have but I think that they have, from what I understand, been successful in having civilian NGOs of women who care about the justice system keep pressing the security forces, particularly the police force, to fulfill their promise not only of promoting women, but of taking gender violence seriously. So that's another lesson we can learn. So I think in some ways we need, as always, we need to trade the lessons we've learned, both the failures, we need to learn from failures, but also the successes, even if they're short term, even if they are limited, because that's the way we're going to build a fuller strategy for having a really, truly gender justice, gender equity form of sustainable peace. So I'm, as somebody who is a student of the endings of war, I try to look into each instance and see what it is we can learn from each instance. Kelly, I think you and your husband and the work you're doing is really important, and it is true that gender means masculinity and femininity. It means ideas about masculinity and ideas about femininity. And the extent to which one can get women and men together persuaded that they both have a stake in justice, they both have a stake in democracy, they both have a stake in the kind of peace that's based on democracy and justice. In fact, it will be more sustainable. Here's, and this kind of flows into Nua's comment from Lebanon as well, and that is, it is absolutely useful and valuable, and for the long run really important, that men begin to have a stake in a kind of relationships between men and women that really can promote justice and nonviolence and democracy. But what's crucial is that men are not brought into a gender equity process, a gender equity movement, in the role of knowing the most, of being the one who knows more about gender equity than their wives do, of being the leaders again in a movement that, while it's important that men be part of the solution and that they really begin to think again, or think maybe for the first time, about how their own ideas of raising boys, how their own ideas about what it means to be a husband, their own ideas about wives and their own respectability, that those things all be tackled, but not in a way that men come away from those efforts thinking that they know more, once again, than do their benighted, domesticated wives or their limited mobility daughters. That's the risk, is that the new ideas, the new efforts could just strengthen men's own sense that, once again, they are the people who can act best in public. They're the people who are the most modern. They are the people who are the most progressive and know best for their daughters and their wives. So bringing men into the process has to be in the context of women's organizing and women being in the public sphere. And I certainly sympathize, Nua, with your the realities of women not being mobile. And oftentimes that means one has to go to their houses rather than holding meetings someplace where women then, as you say, can't go or aren't able to go or are fearful to go or don't have the bus fare to go. I think you're absolutely right about those limitations. But men can't be brought into the newest modernizing, if you will, in quotes, movement, or the newest justice movement, in a way that reinforces the sense that they are the natural leaders of their households and their societies. Rebecca, this really flows into your question as well, and that is about women and their role in peace building. There is nothing that is anatomically peaceful about women, even child raising. That women's leadership in peace movements oftentimes has to do, and I think this was brought up earlier, maybe by Milena in her first comment, about socialization. That is, we learn to be peaceful, or we learn to be militaristic. And one of the somewhat advantages of women being marginalized in most conventional politics is that more women than men have been able to protect themselves from the socialization into masculine ideas about militarism. And that's an advantage. And if when women then get into politics, and this goes back to the other Rebecca's question about what's happening to women parliamentarians in Afghanistan, when women become socialized into politics or into the security forces, institutional cultures, it has to be with alternative socialization. You can militarize women just as much as you can militarize men. And there is nothing kind of in our veins that make us peaceful. It's been in our experiences. We haven't had the rewards that come from being the most overtly militarized, and that's one of the reasons we can imagine a different future. So socialization matters. Women can be socialized into patriarchy. Women can be socialized into militarism. And we, as feminists, I think, all of us working in our own countries, but also working together in webinars like this, are trying to teach each other a different set of values, a different alternative set of visions, a different way of relating to each other that is not based on fear and insecurity. Oh, this is my chance to, I don't want to wrap up. I want us to keep going. So I just want to say to everybody, thank you so much for inviting me. Thanks to wonderful Emma and Maria and Barbara for making it possible for us all to be in the virtual room together. And I'm going to be in Sweden next week. I'm going to be in Beirut in April. And hopefully I'll get to meet all of you at some point, someplace, and you can keep on teaching me. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. It was so great to have you with us. I'm going to give now the floor to Barbara for some closing remarks. But really, I would like to thank you from all of us. Just Barbara, hold on a second so that I can give you the webcam, and we can all see you.
Yes, hi again. So I will have just a very few final remarks. And first of all, I would like to thank you so much, Cynthia, for having this lecture for us today. And it was a very informative introduction to Women, Peace and Security agenda, and very important because you discussed the main concept that we will be building upon during our future webinars. And at the same time, I would like to thank so much to all of you who participated today and who are with us. It's really great that there were so many of you, because it means that so many of you actually are interested in this topic and care about this topic, which is very important. And oh yes, we have the slide with the emails. It's our first webinar of this series, so we'll be delighted if you can send us any comments, if you have any feedbacks. If there is something didn't work for you today or something you really like and we should develop further, just please let us know. And also, if you are not able to write down these emails, you will get a follow-up email from us, all of you who participated today, which will include our emails, but which will also include a web page to WILPF Academic Network and also to other WILPF webinars, where you can just take a look at other events that are going on and will be going on very soon. And last but not least, I would like to alert you to keep an eye out for another event that the WILPF Academic Network will be involved in. This will be a lecture by one of our wonderful scholars, Joy Onesho. And Joy will be speaking about women, peace and security in Nigeria. So this will be a very good chance to get some insight on this agenda from Global South. This lecture will take place on November 12th. It will be at Wesley College in Boston. But we are working now to be able to broadcast this lecture so that as many of you as possible can participate in this. So once again, thank you so much.